Here we go, the ISTJ. This is, in my opinion, the most misunderstood cognitive type, and I've been really looking forward to getting this video out. I'm going to give you 5 reasons to consider why you yourself may actually be an ISTJ, and hopefully dispel a myth or two along the way. And it is to those of you who consider yourselves to be too relaxed, peace-seeking and creative to be this type that I dedicate the first sign of this video to. So sign number 1 that you may actually be an ISTJ, introverted sensing dominance. For some reason, people seem to associate a highly introverted and reflective function with a host of extroverted implications. People assign the ISTJ highly industrious, work ethic bound stereotypes, but then say, hey, they still don't like people, so they must still be introverts. Don't get me wrong, there are ISTJs, especially among older generations, who do conform to their workaholic, hyper-organizational and routine-bound stereotype, but they do so in spite of their dominant functions rather than because of them. Due to the position of introverted feeling within this type, ISTJs may have traditionally been more prone to manifestations of divergent subtypes. That is where an introvert is essentially pushed to be more extroverted, usually associated with some kind of survival mindset. When the world is falling apart, introverts can become hypervigilant, as, frankly, they cannot afford to take the time out for themselves to be introverts. People see the relentless, hypervigilant, extroverted thinking, the routines that are necessary in order for a divergent introvert to be able to sustain any amount of prolonged extroversion, slap an introverted sensing label on it and call it a day. But in reality, introverted sensing is not the routine function. Routines are the means by which conscientious extroverts and introverts optimize their lives. Sure, some introverts may do this more out of energetic necessity, but it is fallacious to equate introverted sensing with routines. Generally, it is ISFJs and INFJs who are the more naturally systematic of the types, relying as they do upon introverted thinking frameworks in order to make up for a lack of extroverted thinking with, you guessed it, routines. ISTJs and INTJs, on the other hand, do not need routines. For extroverted thinking, in each type can take in external information without relying upon a pre-existing internal model to account for it. So many ISTJs I've tapped have had difficulty coming to terms with the type because they are simply not routine-based people. And ISTJs from newer generations in particular seem far less within a survival state, and therefore having more time to stay in a reflective SI-FI. To be an introverted sensing dominant is to spend time in a high-fidelity internal world. Sure, this internal world may not necessarily be as off the rails as introverted intuition dominance, but on the flip side, the imaginative product of the SI dominant can often feel more real than external reality itself, and it's hard to get more abstract than that. If you consider yourself someone with a strong and vivid imagination, who loves nothing more than to take time out to spend within a reflective, introverted sensing, introverted feeling in a world, ISTJ may be worth considering. Sign number 2 that you may be an ISTJ, introverted feeling convergence. So as I've said in previous videos, there isn't really such thing as introverted sensing. In reality, cognitive functions work in pairs, and therefore produce a kind of cognition through their interaction with each other. As such, ISFJs and ISTJs do not technically share the same dominant function. In fact, the cognition of each of these types is radically different to each other. And putting too much emphasis upon this introverted sensing label we whack on the top of a cognitive map can blind us to this. You see, unlike the SITI of the ISFJ, the dominant pairing of the ISTJ is SI-FI. That is introverted sensing, introverted feeling. This is a type that by default spends a lot of time interacting with their emotions, values, and self-concept. This isn't some tertiary function the type goes into every now and again to take a break from relentless productivity. And as a lens-dominant type, the emphasis is for introverted sensing to essentially orbit around a more secure and consistent introverted feeling, generally from a more experiential perspective than a rational one. As such, unlike the INFP who spends time changing the product of introverted feeling, the ISTJ instead perceives upon a less fluid introverted feeling from a experiential perspective. Introverted feeling therefore feels more solid and consistent. For example, ISTJs can more easily take pride upon their achievement and their resilience. because the lens dominant type here can enjoy the product of FI. ISTJs and INFPs share the same functions, but people all too often portray them as opposite types, when the only real difference here is the different emphasis of attitudes. The Kodak dominant INFP tends to more voluntarily change and shape the self, whereas the ISTJ can more consistently reflect upon a sense of continuity. So you can essentially call both types perceiving types in their own way. The INFP is called a perceiving type by MBTI because their extroverted thinking isn't quite as demonstrable as their extroverted intuition, whereas the ISTJ is technically the true perceiving type because their dominant function is a perceiving function. Both things here can be true, and I'd say too much of this typology stuff is dominated by either-or mentalities. So unless we are talking about an ISTJ in survival mode, chances are this is a gentle and peace-loving individual who forms strong and enduring bonds, and even deeper convictions. And it is the more consistent and concrete nature of SIFI that lends this type such conviction. In fact, when I think ISTJ, I don't think of some routine-based automaton, but rather a naturally independent person with unshakable convictions and integrity. And the taxonomy from which these concepts originate actually contribute to this misunderstanding. People would see the word dominant and assume the introverted feeling of an INFP, whose dominant function is introverted feeling here, would therefore be stronger and more sovereign over not only their cognition but their behavioral output. But in reality, both the INFP and the ISTJ are introverted feeling dominants in their own right. The INFP places emphasis upon changing introverted feeling to facilitate a harder introverted sensing perspective, whereas the ISTJ changes upon introverted sensing perspective in order to facilitate a harder introverted feeling. Both types will be seen living in accordance with their own values, and both will tend to embody integrity and self-respect. And ironically, owing to the agency position of introverted feeling within this type, the ISTJ may actually be more likely than the INFP to form any kind of attachment to a type label in the first place. And a final word on introverted sensing. This is an internal lens of a more concrete and precise nature. Concrete does not mean banal, but rather something that is closer to a ground rather than approximate truth. And ISTJs seek such concrete ground truth within FI more than TI. If you're a human being, some of this will probably resonate with you. If a lot of it resonates with you, you might be an ISTJ. Sign number 3 that you might be an ISTJ, the extroverted thinking authority. So this type isn't all about SIFI deep diving. And the stereotypes, they're not entirely wrong. They're just mostly wrong. Most of the time people tend to see the organizational NeTe of this type more than the sensitive SIFI that pairing conceals. It follows that people of this type would seek to protect this vulnerable core through a combination of competency and privacy. And it is in the realm of competency that the extroverted thinking authority shines the most. In essence, the extroverted thinking competency this type, that is the ability to meet external standards and thrive within external parameters, acts as a kind of bedrock upon which identity can be formed. Many of this SIFI dominant would strive for an ideal version of the self based upon TE parameters. More often than not, ISTJs are in this kind of continuous competition with the self as they constantly seek to improve themselves to the next demonstrable level. But this TE authority can be a double-edged sword. This type tends to hold themselves to extremely high standards, and their pride can suffer a blow should they ever fall short of their own expectations. And what's more and more, neurotic manifestations of this type, these standards of the self can extend to others as well. And it is on those occasions when the stereotypes of, enforcing rules and standards upon other people can come into play. If you find yourself in a kind of perpetual state of competition with the self, and perhaps use external parameters such as rank and competence to build your self-esteem, SIFI dominance might be worth considering. Sign number 4 that you might be an ISTJ, extroverted intuition, extroverted thinking, divergence. For many, but not all ISTJs, the external world must be first harmonized before the type feels comfortable resting within the security of their peaceful dominant pairing. This is a type that can feel vigilant against anything that might come out of left field and can lead to some kind of survivalistic tendencies. Again, there is a reason why so many ISTJs are in positions of upper management, be it a CEO, general, or even president. NeTe Divergence naturally surveys the external world, accounting for myriad different perspectives to ensure decisions are made in full light of their potential consequences. If you're pitching a costly idea, it might be an ISTJ who tells you it won't work. If your department is being overlooked or treated unfairly, it'll often be an ISTJ who takes action. There is often no cognition better suited to getting a thorough lay of the land and making complex managerial decisions based upon countless interacting variables. This type is often a natural strategist, a true mastermind even, and it saddens me how often it gets overlooked by this community. However, this naturally vigilant attitude can cause a great deal of strain upon this type's peace of mind, especially when they are burdened with many the responsibility. And for this reason, ISTJs who are in positions of great stress, or who are just simply less healthy variants, may seek to eliminate as many possibilities as possible in order to, for example, alleviate anxiety. And in this NE-derived state, the ISTJs can become the stuck-in-their-ways late adopters that they tend to be stereotyped as. And when this less healthy pattern is coupled with their oftentimes iron beliefs and values, the type naturally gifted at strategic leadership and risk assessment can become rigid, stubborn, or even antagonistic towards the collective. And this leads me to my next point, the NeFe Blindspot. There are a lot of people who have successfully identified their introverted feeling preference, but completely overlook ISTJ owing to the unhealthy stereotypes that are often assigned to it. And a good tell here is to look at what extroverted feeling is doing in the psyche. Look to how you interact with others, how many social faux pas you tend to commit, and perhaps more importantly, how easily you can turn off any kind of consideration as to what other people might think of you. Stick to your guns. And if this is you, you should be strongly considering ISTJ. Standing like a rock in the face of adversity is definitely one of this type's fortes. The ISTJ is often so unwavering in their FI integrity and sense of self that they can seldom be swayed by any extroverted feeling-based manipulation strategies, such as, for example, emotional blackmail, or appeal to universal values, or even emotional reciprocity. And it is not that the ISTJ would not be deeply affected by such things, but extroverted feeling simply tends to be a lower cognitive priority. And as it is low priority, it can be more easily pushed aside for the sake of perhaps standing up for the self. And this often means they will not mince their words either. If you ever need honest feedback from someone who will just tell you like it is, an ISTJ is often a good choice. And this can all be great, but does come with the caveat of a higher difficulty meaningfully engaging with others. ISTJs and even INTJs can often be stiff in their social mannerisms, and they may not necessarily notice the awkward silences that may ensue when they simply do not know what to say. There can be a disconnect of social affect here, and while I've not yet met a single SIFI dominant who lacks a kind of warmth, unlike the FI dominants, this FI agency type may struggle with more musical social interactions. For example, their pitch may be flat and monotone. Facial expressions would tend to be quite subtle, and out of all of the 16 types, this is a type who can struggle the most with small talk. In essence, while SEFE, warmth and intimacy, may not be so difficult for this type, the more musical and amorphous extroverted feeling employment that is NeFe may be much more of a struggle. A pairing often associated with humour, for example, there is a good reason why comedy tends not to be the ISTJ's forte. Although I would add that ISTJs who I've known have tended to possess an excellent dry wit. Bonus point, holistic logic. The single biggest thing people get wrong about this type is the hyper-detailed, mathematical and logically precise stereotypes assigned to it. In so many ways they could not be more wrong. Typically it is the INTJ who is the more precise and mathematical in their logic, possessing as they do an ST pairing rather than an NT pairing. an opposing pairing of SETE rather than NETE, an introverted thinking pairing of SITI rather than, as in the case of the ISTJ, NITI. ISTJs, by contrast, think a lot more intuitively. Yes, the type still tends to be pragmatic and generally averse to risks, but their actual thought process itself is more naturally holistic and general. In fact, this type may even struggle with more precise logic. Typically, it is the INTJ who wants to go into the underlying mechanisms, the actual raw facts within a data set, for example, really parsing out one micro detail from another one. And it is the ISTJ who wants the general principle, the pattern, the heuristic, even. And this would explain why so many ISTJs I have typed and even met in real life tend to be much more drawn towards the mystical, that which cannot be so easily explained by science. Mysticism, the supernatural, even. These are often areas of interest I'd associate more with ISTJs than INTJs. And it would make sense given the more intuitive, generalistic and holistic nature of their thinking pairing. Not to mention the implications for introverted sense and convergence, whereby the internal world feels more naturally real than the external world, and even imbuing the world with a more natural sense of awe and wonder. The ISTJ may even struggle with more precise logic, thinking as they do in more of a general overview. They may prefer to employ heuristics and cyclical logic, for example, thinking in patterns, than, step-by-step deductions. Indeed, I'd even say this type tends to be more action-oriented than the INTJ, preferring a faster process of thought that can get the overall impression without getting stuck in the details. And it's also the more general approach to logic that lends this type their more oftentimes philosophical persuasion. I mean, sure, not every ISTJ is going to be reading through philosophy books, which kind of goes back to what I was talking about before in regards to details. But the way they think itself is very much naturally philosophical. NT pairings as a whole prefer to operate according to general principles and frequencies, common tones, for example. And beneath the oftentimes tough exterior of this type is a soft heart that romanticizes the profound and the mystical. And that concludes the video. Thank you so much for watching, and if you know anyone who you suspect might be an ISTJ, please share this video with them. If you yourself are wondering what type you might be, perhaps you might be an ISTJ, for example, you can get typed by me or my friend Rob on cognitivepersonality.com. If you would like to support the theory and the channel on that additional level, I highly recommend checking out the Patreon page. And for those of you who would prefer to join a CPT community without signing up for Patreon in order to access it, there is a CPT Facebook group that I've linked down below. So that concludes the video, and I'll be back in a few weeks' time. For now, take care.